will appreciate and enjoy what we have to bring for you tonight. Our teacher tonight is Professor Julian Hill. He is an assistant professor at Georgia State University College of Law. He's a teacher, a lifelong learner. He's a community organizer, an artist, an attorney, and he knows that we have to fight for the world that we deserve. His research focuses on how lawyers can leverage corporate, local, government, and contract law to build a solidarity economy that prioritizes people and the planet over profits. Professor Hill regularly advises worker cooperatives, collectives, nonprofits, and small businesses on a range of matters, including governance, leasing, and contracts. Professor Hill is also known to partner with community-based organizations to co-facilitate political education and co-develop policies and campaigns. He has facilitated workshops both in English and Spanish on worker cooperatives and the solidarity economy with Law for Black Lives, the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, Democracy at Work Institute, and the New York City Network of Worker Cooperatives, among others. Dr. Hill has prepared and delivered testimony before both the New York State Assembly and the New York City Council on issues facing worker cooperatives and small businesses in New York. Brother is an activist, he's a scholar, and we are happy to bring him here. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about Black solidarity economy lawyering. Black solidarity economy lawyering. Brother Hill, how you doing?
Doing well. Good to see you. Good to be in space with you.
Good. Go ahead and take it over.
All right. So let me go ahead and start to share my screen. Is this visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Perfect. Okay, cool. So greetings, everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here, particularly with Baba Mukungu, one of my elders in this organizing space and who I have a deep respect for. And to be part of this series, I've been seeing some of the different sessions over the past couple of years, and I'm just glad to be a part of it. So as Baba Mukungu mentioned before, I'm going to be talking to you all about Black solidarity economy lawyering. And the hope with this session is really to do a few things. One, I'm hoping to just increase folks' just general understanding around what the solidarity economy is as compared to our existing economy. I also want to increase folks' awareness of certain lineages of Black folks who've been engaging in the solidarity economy generally, but also on the legal side as well. And then finally, I want to increase some of the understanding around some of the inherent contradictions, some of the limitations, some of the risks that Black lawyers have to sort of think about as we engage in supporting sort of a broader Black solidarity economy, and to be real about that. And so I come to you all, I've done this work particularly around solidarity economies for about 7 years. And I understand that there's a dearth of Black lawyers in this space, and there's sort of an evolving theory of change that I've been kind of going through as it relates to this work. And so I'm really excited about this conversation. So I put together a little presentation with some visuals. And so this is kind of what I'm thinking about moving through. And the hope is that I can get through my remarks in about 30 minutes or so and leave around that same amount of time for us to sort of be in conversation, to answer questions, to maybe ask some questions as well. And so first, I'm going to start with just a snapshot of our current economy, just so we're on the same page. I don't want to assume people's knowledge of these things in this space. Talk specifically about the solidarity economy as an alternative, what it is, what it isn't. Link that to some of the work around sort of Black liberation and Black radical tradition, and sort of this larger critique of capitalism and the use of solidarity economies. And then I'll end out, funny enough, I'm actually talking about Black solidarity economy lawyering. And so hopefully I'm not disappointing folks with respect to that, but I wanted to at least make sure that we have some familiar language and frameworks before I get into the lawyering piece. And unfortunately, what you'll see once we get there, there's not a ton that I've been able to dig up around sort of these different lineages, which is a thing that I know one of my comrades, Derica, has talked about in a couple of different spaces. And I'm interested in doing more of that excavation, more of that work after this presentation as well. So let's just start off with thinking about our current economy. And so there are a lot of different ways folks think about economies. Generally, I could have probably put 5 or 6 definitions here, but again, it sort of places us all in the same headspace. So we're talking, if we're thinking about it within the context of a traditional dictionary, Merriam-Webster's structure or conditions of economic life in a given country or a given area. And when we think about economic life, we're talking about how do we produce goods, how are those goods distributed, consumed, and I would also extend to different services, okay? I like the definition provided by Economics for Liberation, which is a bit more straightforward. It's just what do we as humans need? And then what are the processes that we use to meet those needs? And if we wanted to break them down to their components again, we're talking about production. So farmers, for example, they plant the seeds, do the weeding, harvest the food, then that food has to be distributed in some way, shape, or form. Might be refined depending on what it is, but eventually it's consumed. And then there's some sort of reproduction where we think about recycling, where we think about what do we do with the waste, and that kind of cyclical process. And so that's kind of how I'm coming to you all today in terms of thinking about an economy. It's really about the needs that we have, the processes we use to meet those needs. In our current economic system, at least here in this part of the empire, is capitalism, right? So it's an economic system that's really about private or corporate ownership of capital goods. And you have investments, and all those decisions are determined by private parties, right? You have prices, you have production, everything can be commodified, right? Even the commons. And then you have a distribution of goods that is determined by this sort of quote unquote free market. And so if we want to think about some of the key features, it's private ownership. There's the idea around everyone is a worker, right? And so sort of wage labor, the idea around we want to maximize profits at all costs. And so shareholder primacy, the other ways that people talk about it. And then commodity production, right? We want to produce things that can help us bring in more profits, that can turn all of us into just consumers, right? So we're all workers and consumers, more or less within the capitalist system, if we're not the actual capitalists. And so I just want to connect this to just how has this system been impacting Black folks, right? And so here are a couple of charts that I think are useful, particularly given when they start, just from a time standpoint. So back in '68, you're talking a little bit before, around the time Nixon sort of announced this whole idea around Black capitalism, right? During a time where we're experiencing the recent assassinations of Black freedom fighters like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and a lot of the riots that were happening, people being very dissatisfied with how our political system, how our economic system was structured and is structured, and the ways in which Black folks were suffering in a lot of ways. And so you look at the chart on the left, talks about income inequality. And so you can see back in '68, the orange line is talking about basically the average income of Black families as compared to white families. So in that particular year, Black families made about 60% of the income that white families were bringing in. And then you look all the way to 2016, right? We got some ups and downs, mostly downs, and we're more or less at the same place. The blue line speaks to the median, right? So if you took all the different inputs of incomes, the idea was that actually back in '68, the median income for Black folks was a little bit higher as compared to that of white families. And so that's just income, right? Another metric that's probably more important is wealth, right? Which is the, the assets that you have on hand, money, property, all those sorts of things that tell us how much you're quote unquote worth, right? Because that's the way in which we quantify people and their value. And so as you can see, again, back in 63, you had a significant dip, not significant dip. So looking at, I guess, 83, where they sort of started to track more for Black families, all the way up to now, you have a sense that white families, when it comes to wealth, like all the assets they have 8 times or had 8 times as much as that of a Black family. This is pre-pandemic. And so I'm sure those numbers have gone down. And then the final chart on the far right is with respect to Hispanic families. But you can see capitalism has not been kind to Black folks, and also just a lot of other marginalized folks. Okay. But what does that mean, right? We can talk about inequality, but how does that land on people's bodies? How does that land on people's actual lives? And here's a chart. It's relatively old. It's probably from about 14 years ago or so. But I can imagine the dots are probably more or less in the same places. But this is talking about the health and social outcomes for folks based on income inequality. So you can see the US on the far right end in terms of the highest level of income equality compared to these other countries. And then on the other axis, we have the worst in the way of health and social problems, right? So life expectancy, infant mortality, right? And if we want to break it down to sort of, let's say, Black folks, these numbers are even worse, right? Trust, mental illness, social mobility. You look at a city like Atlanta, where compared to other places, other cities, you have the least likelihood of exiting poverty if that's what you're born into, right? And this quote unquote Black Mecca of the US. But on top of that, I think it's important to think about the ways in which capitalism really focuses on and funnels us into different dynamics around consolidation of power, right? And so this chart is interesting because if you look at all of these different industries on the left, it says, if you look on the far left part of the different bars, so at the top, hardware stores, in the early 2000s, the top 2 companies in the hardware store industry, I'm guessing probably Home Depot, Lowe's or something like that, they were able to basically capture about 40% of the sales in the hardware store industry. And by 2019, that number had increased to just over 80%. And so not only do you have a lot of these issues with respect to poor outcomes for marginalized people and Black folks in particular, but a lot of that's also being pushed by the further consolidation of power within the hands of fewer and fewer businesses, right? And this is a really interesting time because you got a situation with Facebook and Amazon and just antitrust, which is the means through which the government tries to combat monopolies, is kind of at an all-time high. And this extends to other important institutions, our media companies, right? We only have basically 6 companies that own most of the media around the country, so on and so forth. Our political institutions, right? You think about Citizens United back in the early 2010s and the ways in which that's impacted money going into our politics. So capitalism has really and continues to run a number on us, right? And so the solidarity economy I want to talk to you all about as an alternative. One of the things I've noticed here in Atlanta and just other cities is the idea around, what are the alternatives? That's a question that comes up. And so what is the solidarity economy? And I'll just note some people use the phrase social and solidarity economy. It has a slightly different connotation, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But the solidarity economy is a global movement to build a just and sustainable economy where we prioritize people and planet over endless profit. And this movement started like in the 80s, early 80s, 90s, mostly in Latin America as a response to the neoliberal economic policies that you were seeing coming from the Reagan administration and other administrations, with the idea that we wanted to have all of these other countries, like I said, mostly Latin America, not have any sort of tariffs on our goods, deregulate, allow for us to put our different goods there to make it easy for us to be involved in their economies, which ended up destroying a lot of their local economies, right? So if we're given a bunch of cheap wheat and putting it into their markets, a lot of their farmers who grow that are going to struggle. And so this was a response to that. And understand that capitalism is really about meeting the needs of shareholders and capitalists and not the needs of people who are on the ground. I think that's important as we think about how does this particular movement that sprang out of this particular context map onto the work and the needs of Black folks here in the United States, right? So there's going to have to be necessarily some variations, some modifications. And so here are some of the principles connected to the solidarity economy. Obviously, solidarity and the idea that we sort of need to depend on each other. Sustainability, understanding that we can't have just infinite growth with a finite number of resources. Equity in all dimensions. So thinking about race, gender, ability, so on and so forth. The idea of participatory democracy and the idea that we shouldn't have these hierarchies where only a few folks are making decisions for all of us. And then pluralism and recognition of the fact that there are different ways that we can have some modifications to the work. It doesn't have to be done the same way in every respect. So one thing I want to say before we move into this chart is you don't really see much in the language about settler colonialism, right? You don't see much in the language that's specifically about anti-Blackness. And so there are ways in which we have to think about how this particular framework has its limitations and modifications that we need to make in the context of what we're trying to do here in the States, okay? And so here's a chart that just talks about some of the differences between sort of a capital approach to an economy, capitalism and solidarity. And I broke them down on a couple of different features. And I want to say I borrowed this from Economics for Liberation. And so when we think about ownership in a capitalist system, the owners are the capitalists, right? They're the folks who already have money, financing. And then when it comes to the production, when it comes to mechanisms for the distribution, capitalists are the owners. Solidarity economy, it's the people or the patrons, depending on what type of institution we're talking about. With respect to allocation of resources, it's simple in capitalism. Whoever has the most money or power, you got the money to pay for it. It doesn't matter if this is the hundredth thing that you bought that is going to go to waste because you're not going to use it. None of that matters. As long as you have the money, you can purchase it. Whereas in the solidarity economy, we try to allocate things based on people's needs. When it comes to the division of labor, there's not necessarily a sharing of labor types in capitalism. The worst jobs, quote unquote, the more physically demanding jobs are typically going to be the least paid. Whereas in the solidarity economy, a lot of the quote unquote, it's probably not the best way of phrasing it, but the quote unquote grunt work, the admin work, all the things that go on behind the scenes, separate from the work that you actually do, is shared across the team, across the owners of the entity, the folks involved. And then when it comes to decision making in capitalism, it's all about property rights and sort of the police state, sort of helping to support and protect those property rights, and folks with property being the ones who can make decisions. Whereas in the solidarity economy, we think about participatory democracy, as I mentioned before, and not representative democracy, to be confused with what we have in our current political system. So here's some examples of different types of activities that happen in the solidarity economy based on the different aspects of an economy, right? So production on the far right and the top, we're talking about how do things get produced. So worker cooperatives, farmer cooperatives would be a type of producer cooperative. When we talk about exchange of goods, exchange of resources, you have community currencies, sliding scale pricing to accommodate folks who might not necessarily have the resources in the same way that others might. Fair trade. When it comes to consumption, housing cooperatives, housing as a thing that we consume, consumer cooperatives, and then financial, talking about how do we deal with surpluses and allocations, right? So credit unions might be a type of entity folks are familiar with. And then when it comes to land, we're talking about the commons and people sort of having sort of a community relationship, one that really harkens back to some of our ancestors' approaches to land, not as something that is a commodity, but as something that has its own life force. It's something that we're in relationship with. And so I was gonna maybe do this as a thing that might be something to solicit something from the chat, but we'll skip this in that respect. But what I wanted to do is basically talk about a place that you like and think about what would it look like in the capitalist system versus in the solidarity economy. And so let's take maybe a local cafe. Maybe you like coffee. I'm a tea person, whatever. But just as an example, cafe probably has maybe one owner, and let's say they have 9 employees. The baristas, folks doing cleaning, folks doing bringing in stuff, so on and so forth. The capitalist system, right? When decisions are made, the only person that needs to be consulted is the owner. The owner doesn't need to consult any of the employees. When the end of the year comes and the revenues that are brought in cover the costs, and then whatever's left over and the profit is allocated, who does it go to? It doesn't go to the employees who actually did the work. It stays with the capitalist and the owner, right? In the solidarity economy context, that same dynamic of one person who's sort of a quote unquote lead and 9 people will be turned on its head so that all 10 of those people are owners, right? So when big decisions are made, all 10 of those folks are going to be involved because you are practicing participatory democracy. You can still have delegation, someone ringing things up, someone cooking food, right? That's not to say that everyone needs to be involved in everything and that people can't have different roles, but it's going to be more participatory, particularly with big decisions. You can still delegate other decisions as well. It's not to say everyone needs to be involved with every decision, but that's a feature that will be different with the cafe. And then when profits come in, the 10 people who are workers would share those profits, and it would be based on how much work each of them did as individuals, okay? As opposed to how much money did they put in. All right. Did this one already. So let's talk a little bit about sort of Black radical tradition and solidarity economy. And so let's keep it a buck, right? We are not new to this, all right? Black folks have ancestral lineages to folks in all parts of the continent who have been engaging in different acts of solidarity, right? And so there are a couple examples I've looked at in my research, particularly around farmers in different parts of West Africa in particular during pre-colonial times, who would collectively buy tools, who would collectively work on each other's land and rotate with an understanding that it's easier and more conducive to us to do these things together than to sort of have everything done in a way where, oh no, this is my land, I do everything, or I bring on people to work for me. The idea is that we are all working collaboratively and supporting each other, right? And we can talk about susus, ways in which people would save money and share in the context of using that as a way to support each other economically, bartering, so many things, right? And the only other thing I'll add with respect to this is you'll notice that on that wheel that I showed you before, not all of those institutions are part of like the social economy where you kind of have things sort of democratically sort of run. So you might have seen on there employee stock option plans, which don't necessarily require that the employees are equal owners when it comes to their level of power compared to the owner. It just kind of gives them a little bit more in the way of access to some of the profits, right? And so we also got to be real about the ways in which the solidarity economy in and of itself is not going to get anybody free, right? And there's sort of needs to be that sort of acknowledgement that this is a tool that can help us think through some of the other aspects around our economy and building institutions, but also more importantly, protecting them. So this is a quote from Jessica Gordon-Nimhard's book, Collective Courage, which talks about the history of African Americans engaged in cooperative economics. So for 2 centuries, enslaved Africans did not earn a regular wage of even their own bodies. But they often saved what money they could and pulled their savings to help buy their own and one another's freedom, especially among family members and spouses. Free African Americans pooled their resources to purchase operating farms toward the end of and immediately after the Civil War. in order to own land and make a living. Freemen and enslaved alike form mutual aid, burial, and beneficial societies, pulling their dues to take care of their sick, look after widows and children, and bury their dead. So even when we talk about Black folks coming here as a part of the enslavement trade, then you have to think about the ways in which, even during those times, the strategies around solidarity that folks brought with them from the continent continue to be in operation. This is not to say there were no hierarchies in Africa and that there were no empires. This is also not to say that, but it is to say that we definitely had these practices that we brought with us that were rooted in sort of equity and solidarity. And so here's some relatively contemporary examples of folks doing work in the solidarity economy space. You have the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Cooperation Jackson, which is a part of a longer movement that was stewarded by the folks from Malcolm X grassroots movement in Jackson, Mississippi, under leadership of a bunch of folks, including Baba Chokwe Lumumba, to sort of think about how do we integrate these sorts of practices with control of the state, specifically a city, in a place where we got a lot of our people. And, varying levels of success within the context of that project. You got the National Black Food and Justice Alliance that's working around food, Repair Nations out of the Bay. And there's a burgeoning National Association of Black Cooperators that's been sort of building up. Pretty much any formation individual engaged seriously in the liberation of Black folks has been thinking about economics as well, both as either a critique of capitalism, understanding its limitations, and more importantly, the ways in which it's really a tool for keeping most of our people impoverished and exploited, but also in thinking about the solidarity economy, cooperative economics in particular, as a part of that, as a thing that we need to think about. So you've got Fannie Lou Hamer here. She started a farming co-op and was involved in this work. You got Ella Baker, who used to train young folks and do a lot of education around cooperative economics and help start consumer co-ops. W.E.B. Du Bois, who did a lot of research around this and actually hosted some conferences around that work. You got Helena Wilson as well, who worked with some of the unions that were at that time really supportive of worker ownership. Claudia Jones, you got the Black Panther Party, got Baba Chokwe, Lumumba, who I mentioned before, you got Malcolm X as well, and George Schuyler, all folks who were involved in this work. And we can go on. Martin Luther King, particularly at the end of his life, was thinking about the limitations of Black capitalism and thinking about sort of cooperatives as well. And so these are some folks I wanted to lift up in terms of doing the work, either having done the work in the past or currently doing some work around cooperatives and specifically solidarity economy work here in Atlanta, in case folks are interested. Folks doing work around land and food with Gangsters to Growers, for specifically working with folks who are coming home. Pecan Milk Co-op, Organization for Human Rights and Democracy. I'm doing some work around this as well in terms of financing these sorts of initiatives. In-state, ATL recently hosted a workshop with Black folks around the solidarity economy. You got Community Movement Builders, which is incubating a few. Malcolm X grassroots movement, which used to do some work around this, and the Guild, which is doing work around community ownership of land. And so I finished out with Black solidarity economy lawyers in particular. And so here's George Howe. He was the general counsel for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is a formation that started back in the mid-50s, really to support Black farmers using the cooperative model. I think it was formed back in DC and it's still alive and well. And so if you hear about some of the litigation connected to Black farmers getting the money that was owed to them by the federal government and the Department of Agriculture, the Federation is very involved and doing really, really dynamic work all throughout the South. And he was also involved with the Southern Cooperative Development Fund. So he's an ancestor now, but is someone who was doing this work prior to me and the folks in my generation who I'm aware of. You got C.B. King, who actually helped put together and do some of the legal work around the new communities. Community Land Trust, which was actually touted as the first community land trust that was founded here in the U.S. And community land trusts, for folks who aren't aware, are typically sort of nonprofit formations where you have communities who actually own plots of land. It was used mostly for farmers at the time, but it's still a very popular model, and people are doing different versions of it. And so C.B. King was very involved with some of the legal work around that when it was formed. Clark Arrington, who is one of my elders in this work, who I look up to, used to do some legal work for Federation of Southern Cooperatives, used to be the general counsel for the ICA group, which does a lot of work around helping people either buy out their companies to convert them into worker cooperatives, but also does some education work. He used to do some legal work with Equal Exchange and helping them get financing. And then was doing a lot of work for a while with Seed Commons, which is a national network of specific types of funders that do what's called non-extractive financing, which is designed to sort of provide folks with money and wait for them to be able to pay it back once they actually are able to turn a profit. Here's a smattering of a bunch of folks, most of whom I'm in some sort of relationship with. And there might be some folks who are missing, so I don't want to presume to know all of these folks, but you got folks based out of Chicago, Baltimore, New York, Philly, the Bay, DC, Boston, Detroit, all up on here. And so a bunch of really good folks. You got, let me see, Dorcas on the left, Gilmore, you got Deborah Jackson, Renee Hatcher, Carmen Huertas. I'm blanking on the sister's name. I'm blanking on the sister's name. You got Whitley Granberry down here on the bottom left, Elizabeth Carter, Lydia Edwards, Greg Jackson, Martina Watson, and again, Baba Clark Arrington. See? And so just the last thing, these are some different hats that Black Solidarity Economy lawyers are able to support with. Transactional support, doing legal research, helping with actual policy, which is all kind of probably more in the sort of the reformist territory. But then there's also support around community education, supporting with organizing strategy, and then supporting with non-policy advocacy, right? That goes beyond just sort of changing policies, but also some of the other sort of community organizing folks are doing, and just kind of making sure that folks are aware of whatever the risks are that they're engaging in. And then finally, before I open it up, I just want to realize some of the limitations and risks of Black Solidarity Economy lawyering. Even in some of the language that I've used for some of the projects that I talked about, you can understand how there's the possibility for co-optation via Black capitalism, and this idea around, on one end of the spectrum, people think about the solidarity economy as a way to really upend and sort of really create a real alternative to our current economic system as part of a larger movement that includes organizing, that includes other ways of resistance. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you got folks who are, let's just kind of create cooperatives and that's it, right? So we still are cool with profits and the way in which labor is structured and financed, and sort of the settler colonial situation that we live in, and that's fine. And so we got to be real about those limitations, and how that relates to sort of revolutionary versus kind of more of an evolutionary approach. Some other limitations, we just don't have enough folks who are in this work. I bet that I probably couldn't give you another slide of that many folks who are Black and doing this work. And that's thinking about it nationally. I could be wrong. Someone can prove me wrong. Let me know. There's limitations in the law itself, right? The law isn't necessarily designed for folks to be engaging in cooperation and solidarity. I teach contracts. I talk to my students all the time. Contracts is about how do we facilitate the free market and capitalism, right? So there's some limitations there. And then just incompetency or lack of interest in movement lawyering. How do we support movements? How do we think about integrating healing and thinking about conflict transformation? So I'm gonna stop there. Here's my email here if folks ever wanna reach out, but I'm done.
All right, thank you, Professor Hill. Appreciate you. Brother Julian, both of those I think are appropriate here. I really appreciate what you've gone over here. And everyone who is actually here on Zoom with us, if you've got some questions that you want to place in the Q&A section, we'll be happy to field some of those questions. But Brother Hill, I want to just start off, just maybe so we can ground some of this conversation. You started out by kind of giving us this context, showing us how historically and currently capitalism has not proven itself to be a salvation for Black people, despite, as you mentioned, Richard Nixon's campaign to develop so-called Black capitalism. Despite these ideas about the power of the Black dollar, there's been some rising research to kind of debunk this idea that somehow there's some magic if Black people would all just get their dollars together. Capitalism itself is a problem. And then you kind of throw out this, you tell us about this solidarity economy. And I want to start with the definition that you put up, that it's a global movement to build a just and sustainable economy that prioritizes people and the planet over endless profit and growth. So just first of all, think about the global movement, not just Black folk, but this movement. What are the objectives of this global movement? That's the first thing. What's the whole point of so-called solidarity economies? What's the objectives?
Yeah, so I think people might give you some different answers to this, right? So if you think internationally, you look at like places like Venezuela, Bolivia, the Zapatistas in Mexico, and then you look at sort of Mondragon in Spain, you look at Emilia-Romagna in Italy, and I think some might think about it as we want to really provide an alternative to capitalism without supplanting capitalism, right?
Okay.
And I think on the other end, if in thinking about it sort of as a kind of more encompassing strategy, is really how do we replace the economic system that we're dealing with now? And I think what's kind of undergirding some of your question, right, is sort of what are the other strategies that are going to actually help us get there? And I think that there could be some more theorizing and thinking that through, right? Because I think we have examples, again, in thinking about sort of more Black capitalist examples where people, Black folks had their cities or towns, right, where they were doing their thing, had the businesses, had all these resources flowing through. Now, mind you, there are also, in the Tulsas of history, a lot of Black folks who were suffering as well, right? It wasn't everyone who was doing well, but they couldn't defend those spaces, right? It didn't necessarily take into account how do we understand that sort of isolated places where we have this sort of self-sustaining economy, capitalist or otherwise, still needs to take into account the realities of how capitalist works, and how capitalists will use any and all state power to sort of keep the certain power dynamic in place. And that's international.
Okay.
Right? So I think there's sort of those two ends of the spectrum. I'm probably more on sort of latter end, but I think there's the strategy piece isn't always fully thought through, in my opinion.
Yeah. So, and again, so and maybe, correct me. There's a major portion of the movement. Again, I'm talking about the movement now, not just Black people, because we're gonna get there. There's some problems as this comes up with Black freedom.
Yeah.
But the big movement, there's kind of embedded in it this idea that if we begin to embed solidarity economy practices from everything from production to distribution to consumption, that those practices in all those areas over time will begin to, they just use the word supplant or replace capitalist production within society. And maybe one day people will look up and say, damn, we got more solidarity economy than we have capitalist economy.
So it's gradual.
There's this gradual transformation of an unjust economy into a more just economy. Am I right on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's embedded in it. I mean, you got the just transition framework as well that I think talks about that.
Mm-hmm. So that's okay. So also just to clear some stuff up,
Mm-hmm.
hey, from your perspective, what is the difference between a solidarity economy and a socialist economy?
Mm, mm.
I mean,
Yeah.
is this just a way of trying to avoid saying socialism so that people
No,
might
no.
like, well,
That's ooh, I love that question. I think that there's there are some differences
mhm,
with between the two. I think with the solidarity economy, both in terms of sort of its gradual nature, like some of the actual institutions that would be counted as part of the solidarity economy,
mhm,
don't necessarily embed sort of this sort of communal ownership or this sort of ownership or stewardship, let's say, by the people in the way that you would have sort of with with a socialist state. And I mean, I think within the context of socialism, you know, it depends if you're talking about sort of like the state being the entity that's going to sort of help allocate and support, or you know, more anarchist kind of less
the reason I'm asking,
formalistic.
I mean, and it, and I hope everybody stays with us on this, but this I
Mm-hmm.
think this is important, right? I think more recent reading and understandings of socialism really it sounds like some of the same things that you're talking about, right? When you talk about participatory
Yep.
democracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people would argue that one of the problems is people misunderstood aims of socialism by placing all the weight on the state as opposed to placing the weight on the people.
Mm-hmm.
The people have the power, right? And so again, I often find myself just wondering, okay, are these some people just trying to sneak in some socialism by not using the word socialism, right? And get people to doing these socialist practices, right?
I think so, and I think it lends itself again to sort of this sort of gradual idea in some ways, right? The idea is that, well, if we can get people to understand within the context of their community, right? Let's talk about like time banking or something like that, right?
Mhm.
Like we have different things that we bring, people have different needs, and we're going to set up a system where we're recognizing that actually, you know, we can meet each other's needs on this block or in this neighborhood, right? And then sort of over time, it's like, okay, let's sort of expand this to sort of the workplace where we own the means of the production, right? So the workers, so on and so forth. So I think there's an argument to be made there that it is an attempt, again, if you're thinking about it as sort of a gradual sort of process, to kind of transition people into to sort of some of the similar practices that you would experience within a socialist framework.
Okay. So, and then just, for people who say, well, I'm not an econ major or whatever, I don't know if I understand this. Just
Me neither.
as an example, let's say that we in a community, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to ask you, does this sound like what you're describing as a solidarity economy, right?
Yep.
We in the community said, damn, this is a food desert here. I got to go 10 miles just to get to the grocery store. We need some food around here. If we were to develop a solidarity economy solution to that problem, what might that look like? What might start to happen in this neighborhood?
Yeah. So you might imagine as like a first step, maybe
Mhm.
people thinking about a like a buying club of some sort, right? So
So
like,
I,
hey,
I I start talking to my neighbors,
yep.
and we say, hey man, look, we got to go grocery shopping anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I'll make the run. Everybody make a list of everything you'll need, and then let's just put all our money in one pot. You make the list, I'll make the run and go and pick everything up. Is there anybody here who, when I
Mm-hmm.
bring it back, will help to put everything in bags and distribute it? With that, and then people then so that would that be a buying club?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be considered a type of buying club. And then, you know, maybe that group expands, more people hearing about it, like, yo, like, let me, you know, I got to get some stuff too. I got a car, like maybe you do this week, I can do next week. And people are able to save money by buying more in bulk.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, eventually you can kind of, depending on the pace of and where things are at, people can think about, well, why don't we just get a space
Let's
where
get
we
us.
can actually build out our own sort of grocery store of sorts, which would be a type of food cooperative.
Right. We
Right.
got a grocery store. Everybody in the neighborhood is a member.
Yep.
So there's no owner. But now we've solved an economic problem that we had. And maybe one of the outcomes of that also is we're finding that because we're buying, and for the produce,
Yep.
we're buying it at a lower level. And because we're not trying to make a major profit, we can resell at a lower level. So there's some advantages to the community.
Absolutely.
Organizing like that. We may want to make some profit so that we can also maybe employ some people to do that work more full time.
Yep. Yep.
But it won't necessarily be as much profit as, say, Publix does.
Mm-hmm.
Even though Publix claims to be a worker-owned co-op. They do.
Yeah, co-optation is real. But also, like, that's what when Ella Baker was going around and doing the work around youth and kind of doing assessments in different communities, right? Like consumer co-ops, right? Identifying people's needs was one of the places where she would typically start, and sort of thinking about food and so on and so forth.
Is that a fair explanation of maybe what a solidarity economy might look like?
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Okay, so now let me ask you this: we got this solidarity economy set up. Okay, and you just happen to live in the neighborhood, and you're a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how are you going to help us? What's your role in all this?
Yeah, so I could play a couple different roles. So one could be, we're trying to figure out what regulations we need to deal with. Like, we don't know what's going on, right? So I could help in doing some research around the different regulations that you need to abide by, food handling licenses, so on and so forth. If you're at the point where you're getting a space, you probably might have to lease it at first. You might not have the capital to buy it, right? If you do got the capital to buy it, in either case, you need to probably negotiate some kind of agreement, whether it's a lease or a purchasing agreement for the space. And some of the ancillary agreements, maybe y'all don't have a legal entity, right? You don't want to be personally liable. So you might say, look, we need something where we all collectively own, right? Or we're all the collective stewards of. And so helping with forming that legal entity, should it be a corporation, an LLC, helping with bylaws, how do you make decisions? How do you become a member? You're bringing on employees, like having employee agreements, talking about the laws you have to abide by, so on and so forth.
Excellent. So that would be some of the idea of what solidarity economy lawyering looks like. I got another question, but there's a couple of questions up here. Lauren says, what is your favorite existing Black co-op and why? And then what is the greatest lesson you've learned from legally supporting or creating your own co-ops?
So my favorite Black co-op. Yeah. Is 700? Is that mostly Black, Ron? I'm not 100% sure.
I don't know if they're Black or not, but
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure.
But that would be an example of a probably an authentic.
Of a food co-op. I don't think I have a favorite per se, because when I'm thinking about favorite, I'm thinking about maybe one that I frequent a lot or that I support a lot, and I spread myself sort of a bit around. But I don't think I have a favorite one at the moment. In terms of the greatest lesson from legally supporting or creating my own co-op, so I have a cooperative that I'm working on that we use hip hop to teach music, and the people who are helping me with it, very much so Black capitalists when they came on board. And so just kind of seeing the transformation among the team and just how they're thinking about and rethinking our economic system, how we should organize as workers has been pretty gratifying. And also just like that it's possible, right? That you can, through political education, which is what we do in addition to the work, just seeing that transformation.
Also, let's see, Brother Philip Lithcott. He says, this is maybe he will allow you to go a little more into what we talked about. He says, I don't recall if you use the word socialist or socialism. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that if we were to if the idea of the solidarity economy or social solidarity economy is being successful, I think what you would be working toward would be sort of a socialist state, in my opinion. And state, depends on
To
how folks
society.
or society. Let's say society. Yep, yep, yep.
Okay. So, and then Sister Chinganji says more about the food deserts. Is a food co-op a precursor? Maybe, and again, and Chinganji, I don't know if we answered that question when we were kind of using that model, but I guess she's saying, would that be a solution? Would a food co-op be a solidarity economy solution to a food desert?
Yeah, I think that would be one of the things that you want to implement, right? If the idea is having access to food, yeah, absolutely, a food co-op would be one of the things to think about. And then you might think about other sort of ancillary kind of things that might be related. Maybe you want to have like a community garden, some sort of place where you're growing food. You might want to have some place where you also like doing composting. You might think about also like public produce, right? Just having stuff that just is available for people to pick on their own. So yeah, I think those would be different things to consider.
Okay.
As well.
And then the final question that's on here from Rosa Lester. What elements, if any, are related to Black Marxism in a solidarity economy?
Yeah, so Cedric Robinson, racial capitalism, is coming up for me in this question. And so I think that the values specifically around equity and sort of recognizing sort of race, gender, these other sorts of ways in which our social location can lead to us being marginalized by society, tries to get a little bit at that, but it's not as explicit, right? And like so, as I mentioned before, it's not like the project of the solidarity economy is to supplant settler colonialism and to be the tool for liberating Black people or liberating Indigenous folks who are being oppressed per se. And so I think there's some of that there. There's also the recognition that the current economy is not working for Black folks or for people in general. But more specific than that, I don't know. What do you think?
You used the term in your talk. You said that, and then you just said again that basically solidarity economy is not going to be a tool to get us free. Right? It's not a tool for liberation.
Not in and of itself, no.
Right. On the other hand, could we fairly think of it as it's a survival program? It's something to help us to survive pending liberation.
I think you can absolutely think about it in that particular context, right? Understanding that even when talking about starting this food co-op or this buying club, like people are presumably going to be working somewhere, probably getting some kind of wages. Right? Unless you're a baller, I don't know. Maybe some ballers on the call.
So as the question of employment comes up, solidarity economy might be one of the things that in communities, we could organize communities to begin thinking about, as opposed to always depending on outside capitalists to employ.
Absolutely.
Right. And because you're saying that there are ways to organize solidarity economies that can actually, and again, profit is not the problem. The distribution of profit is the problem, but there are ways to create profits so that people could sustain their lives.
Yeah, and that's precisely the part of the issue with our current system is that profit is sort of kept up here.
Profit is for the capitalist.
Yeah, for the capitalists, and so ideally, in a lot of ways, you wouldn't really have a profit because people would sort of just be getting whatever it is. It relates to the labor that they provided. So there's a universe where I think you have it both being used as survival programs, but then also if you have the other elements that are going to be necessary for really transforming society, there will also be elements of the solidarity economy that would be central or very much so integrated into that sort of more transformed society as well. So I think it's a little bit of both
Can you say a little bit more about that? I'm not sure I'm understanding what you're saying. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So if the idea is that there are considerations around how to deal with violence,
Okay.
state,
Mhm.
considerations around how to actually do sort of community education, if there are ways in which you think about capturing political power, right? Like these aren't things that are inherent to the solidarity economy itself, right?
Mhm.
It's prescribing a particular way of organizing our economy.
Mhm.
But there are these other elements that are necessary. And so assuming you have those elements in place, and tomorrow capitalism has been thrown asunder,
Mhm.
corporations are whatever the case is going to be,
Mhm.
then the same practices around, let's say, time banking or doing things like buying clubs
Mhm.
or doing things like community gardens or communal ownership of land through some kind of like community land trust, maybe not with that language.
Mhm.
Those will still I think be central practices in that.
One of the things that I thought about as you were talking is Malcolm's speech, "The Ballad or the Bullet."
Mm.
And the whole point in that speech, Malcolm he's advocating organizing around electoral politics, but also organizing the economy of the Black community. And if you listen closely to that speech, Malcolm is not kind of acquiescing to the American political system, but he's saying by getting our people, organizing our people, registering them to vote, organizing them around political campaigns, it also teaches the people how to run their own community, how to run their own nation. That's that, and I believe that was Malcolm's ultimate idea, right? And so, what I'm hearing you say is that by even though these solidarity economy programs are not liberation tools, they also teach our people the tools necessary to survive in sovereignty for ourselves, to be a people for ourselves, and self-determining as a people. It gives us those skills and things that we need because any society needs an economy.
And I think it's important to be intentional around that, as opposed to we have this institution set up and that's it, right? And so there are ways in which thinking about how these skills will be useful once we get victory is a different conversation versus I'm just trying to do what I need to do for right now. And that's the only way in which I'm conceptualizing the utility of these particular institutions, right? And so I think we have to make that connection and continue to sort of make that connection for folks like, yeah, this is useful now, but we're also building skills that folks will be use later. And there's some intentionality around it.
My daddy used to say, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready.
Exactly.
And so this is a way for us as a people to begin staying ready, building the institutions, the skills, the systems, and the networks for us to be self-determining people when the opportunity comes for us to be able to do that, as opposed to trying to wait till after freedom, right, to get ourselves together. Absolutely.
Yeah, man. And I think there are lots of aspects to that quote unquote new society that where that's applicable, right? Think about abolition and sort of creating ways for us to deal with conflict. Get into that practice now is useful.
Absolutely. Now I got one more question, and then I know we got to go. Let's talk a little bit. The idea, I think that idea this is another idea that gets put out a lot, but nobody talks. Well, what is it? Let's talk about what is participatory democracy and why is that significant to this solidarity economy movement?
Yeah, so I think a good way the way I like to explain it to folks is to compare it to sort of our political democracy that we have now, which is a representative democracy. Since that people come together in that particular system, we have different people that sort of we vote for, they get elected, and then there are quote unquote representatives, and they have a term for a certain number of years, and they, in a lot of ways, have a lot of autonomy to sort of do what it is that they want to do. So you think about what's going on with Cop City. Like people are saying, actually, we may not want this thing, but their quote unquote representatives are in a lot of ways sort of in contravention. So participatory democracy is more around having sort of local and then sort of scaling up ways for people to engage in what's happening in their communities, right? So it's not just about going and voting, but it's also like how we teach people what it means to be engaged, giving people opportunities to be engaged, and then giving people the opportunity to take different roles to support within the context of our particular sort of community. So it's very much so, you think about people's assemblies as a part of that, right? And so you can think about sort of Black, you know, sort of, I'm blanking on the name, like Black clubs, neighborhood associations, right? All these ways in which you're encouraging people's participation, not so that they can elect someone who sort of ends up being in the pockets of corporations, but so that people can engage.
So one of the things, for instance, right now, the only time you participate in democracy is once every 2 years or whatever in November. Whereas I heard you, for instance, mentioning early, what if, you know, and you can't vote around things that really affect your lives, like whether or not your company's going to move out of town or not, or whether or not your store is going to sell stuff to you that really is good for you, or just sell stuff just to make them more money. What if the place where you worked, you also were able to vote as a worker on the policies of that place? Now, some people say, well, what do a worker know about making policy? But, you know, if we got to make a legal decision, we bring in somebody like you to give a talk like this to inform the workers, and the workers ask questions. And then after that, the workers say, okay, let's take a vote about what we want to do, because now we have the information. So we still utilize experts around certain areas to educate people, but the people also have the ability to actually have a say-so in something that's going to affect their lives, like whether or not they get a raise, whether or not their job actually leaves the neighborhood, right? Or whatever it is. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you made that connection to your original question. Yeah, it's like, how do we, like, people spend over half of their day or close to half of their day in their place of work. I mean, we tout democracy as a thing that's invaluable, but that's the one place where we don't give people,
you don't have any power,
way to democratically participate. So yeah, it's absolutely that idea around how do we implement that into the context of the workplace.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Hill, we appreciate this wonderful talk on solidarity economy lawyering. I'm hoping that some people who hear this are going to get some ideas about how they can build a solidarity economy. I'm going to sneak in a socialist economy program, right? And now you know that there are people who have some expertise that you can go to help you do the little knit things that will help you fit that solidarity economy into the capitalist structure that's so awkward right now, right? But it also then will give you the way to be able to survive more fully within this system that we live in. So again, we want to thank you on behalf of the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University. For those of you who are students, he's over there at the School of Law. If you're thinking about going to law school, right, you can check him out. I just like to encourage you one small announcement. The Department of Africana Studies has restarted our study abroad program. We will be going to South Africa this this spring. Check in with the Department of Africana Studies. We would encourage you to, if you're a student, to consider traveling to South Africa with us, where we're going to be studying race, class, and gender in contemporary South Africa. And we'll be going to Johannesburg and Cape Town. Maybe you can come with us, Professor, and help us talk about some of these issues and the economies of South Africa right now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Let's talk. Let's talk.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, once again. We appreciate all the questions that came up for us. And we will see you next week, where Dr. King will be talking to us around education. And I'll be back also facilitating that talk around questions of pedagogy and liberation. Thank everyone, and we will see everyone at Freedom School when we come back again next week.